r/AskReddit by Reddit and chill. People who can speak multiple languages. What language do you think in? I'm fluent in English. Vietnamese is my mother tongue. Speak a little French. I mainly think in English since I moved to US, but my dreams come in Vietnamese still. I know someone whose first language is Italian. He started learning English at around 4 or 5 when he moved to Australia, and has been speaking English ever since. But he only ever dreams in Italian and sometimes speaks in Italian in his sleep. It's pretty funny when he speaks it in his sleep. If I'm ever in a situation where I've heard him do it, I say shit like pizza, spaghetti, mamma mia, and he responds in Italian. Haha, that's actually very funny. Also interesting cause English has been his language the majority of his life. French when I speak French. English when I speak English. Sometimes English when I speak French. I'm French though. That's weird. Sometimes it's faster to just think in English rather than French, it seems. I mean, the numbers alone. It's interesting to see so many people with English as their second or third language and they only think in English. Interesting stuff. I think that's just due to the world we live in right now. For me, I think either in the language I'm currently engaged in, for example reading the comments on here. I don't jump back to German as I'm writing this, or in a sort of in-between state. Sometimes it's less language and more like a series of pictures that form a coherent situation in my mind without any words in the mix. Sometimes I find myself with the question of what language did I just think that in and being unable to answer. After the fact you can put it into words. Of course. I've read in the past, probably here on Reddit, that many people do not think in dialogue at all, instead describing an entirely associative-like process similar to what you're talking about. Not me, though. All words. All the time. Monologue might be a better word. I'm pretty sure this is the thread I'm remembering. My first language. Romanian second. German third. English my brain. Duck your mother language, let's go with English. Does it switch around or is it mostly just English? Not switch. Not mostly. It's entirely English. I am fluent in both Spanish and English. But I only think in English, lol. Is it your original language or is Spanish? Spanish is my first language but I don't really think in it much at all. I can think in them all. When I'm speaking a language, I think in that language even if I'm not 100% fluent. When I'm not speaking, I generally think in one of 2 languages I'm a native speaker in. I don't consciously control it. Sometimes I'm surrounded by one language and my brain randomly starts thinking in the other, but usually I'll think in the language I last used. I'm currently learning Swedish and it's gotten to the point where if I see an object the Swedish word for it pops into my head before the English word does. It's a good thing. I am trying to become fluent. I often practice a lot of Swedish to myself. I sometimes practice on my boyfriend too. He's actually Swedish, but I'm still too embarrassed to try and have a full-blown Swedish conversation with him. One day. I am a slow learner, but I'm in the long game and if I can become at least somewhat fluent in it, I'll be happy. One thing I can recommend is not being ashamed to speak. Just go with it. As long as you get your point across. It doesn't matter that you made some mistakes. Talk to your boyfriend in Swedish or find a local group where people practice Swedish so that you can practice with strangers. Joe's opinions won't matter. Speaking the language speeds up learning it so much. And it makes the language more natural to you. Anyway, good luck. First language. Danish. Second language. English. Third language. German. It switches between Danish and English. Edit. Rip my inbox. Edit 2. Thank you kind stranger for my first silver. Does it mix like every other word, words or complete thoughts then the next is a different language? This is what I want to know. I'm Anglo and my French is fading, but when I'm super pissed I swear in Canadian French, if only in my head. I forced myself to think in Dutch when I was learning it. It's a good way to speed up learning a language. French Canadian swear words are the best and most effective imo. Tabarnak de Calis. My first language is Swedish, but I'm fluent in English and pretty much only speak English at home. I can also understand Danish and Norwegian and speak a bit of French. I mostly think and dream in English unless I've been reading a lot of Swedish, or if I'm doing stuff where my vocabulary is lacking in English. I knew it. Scandinavians know a lot of languages. As a Swede, I won't say I completely know Norwegian and Danish. But there is so much overlap between all three languages, so it's usually quite easy to understand them unless they have a very thick accent. Cough cough, Danish people cough cough. While I was in seminary at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, there was a professor there who was very skilled in languages. For example, he was planning a trip to Turkey to study something. And someone asked him why he was reading a book in German, and he said the best book on some specific part of the Turkish language is written in German. There was a story that might have been urban legend. But one day he was walking across the quad and the school president stopped him and said, "Dr. Gentry, how are things going? I'm disappointed." Why? Because I know 9 languages, but can only think in 5 of them. Edited to add, comma school. Row. So Erdogan himself asked him how things are going. Just casually friends with Turkey's president. No biggie. I started off thinking in English and then translating Spanish into English in my head. It took a lot of effort. The weirdest thing was when I started knowing words in Spanish that I didn't know in English. And then it was weird again when I started understanding Spanish words and sentences without having to consciously translate them into English first. It was like I would hear someone say something in Spanish and the understanding of the whole meaning of the sentence would pop into my head the same way as when someone said something in English. I learned English much earlier in life. So that's my default. But if I'm hearing Spanish or listening to Spanish music or media, or even sometimes when I'm not, there are a lot of times when I think in Spanish too. And honestly, I kind of prefer thinking in Spanish. But I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's that the music is better? Very interesting, thank you. In my case, my native language is Spanish, but I learned English since preschool, so I've known and been fluent in both since I was little. I tend to think in whatever language I'm most surrounded by. If I'm at USA, then English. Vice versa when I'm back in Puerto Rico. One thing that never changes is the fact that I always memorize, think, and recite my numbers in Spanish. Memorizing numbers in Spanish comes much more naturally. Everything from phone numbers to my bank account. Everything number related I memorize in Spanish. It's funny when I'm on the phone in English and I have to give numbers to someone, cause I have to translate it at the same time I recite it to the person, and sometimes I mess up, lol. I also find that when trying to describe how I'm feeling, Spanish comes more naturally to me. That is, telling someone I love or appreciate them. And if I'm doing anything where I have to think of instructions, it's English that comes more naturally to me. It's weird. It's on a case-by-case basis for me. I speak Portuguese, English, Spanish and German. In my house, multiple languages were spoken in a mix at all times. Words and sentence weren't exactly from the same language. When I speak with my family like that, I think in no language in particular, and it's second nature. When just speaking a single language at a time, I typically think in that language. When it comes to counting, it's mostly German. My first language is English and second is French. I'm currently attempting to learn German. But every time I get stuck or can't think of the right German word, I start thinking in French. And I don't even speak French that well. My first language is Portuguese and I can speak a little bit of Spanish, and I'm fluent in English. I'm not surrounded by people talking in English whatsoever, yet I mostly think in English. It makes no sense to me, but oh well. I've always wondered but never asked. Are Portuguese and Spanish similar languages? Like, do they share word sounds, that sort of thing? Yes. We share some words and sounds, and we can usually understand each other with just a little bit of effort, even if we don't know how to properly say something, although some regions in Spain talk way too fast. With that in mind, I'd say it can be somewhat offensive when people just assume it's all the same, because at the end of the day they are two different languages. So I'm glad you asked. I consider myself to be fairly fluent in English. My thoughts partially switched to it when I was around 17 years old. I had been speaking a little English since I was 3. But I started seriously studying the language only when I turned 16. Currently, my inner monologue is both in English and in my native language. When I'm giving a speech in my head, discussing some concept with myself, I usually think in English. On the other hand, my inner voice uses my native language for the most of the mundane things. Like my exams are tomorrow. Yet here I am, browsing Reddit. Also, on some rare occasions, I hear nothing and just know what I'm thinking about. Much the same here. Having been fluent in my native language and English since a very young age, it's sometimes even hard to tell which I'm thinking in. But it goes back and forth super easily. And sometimes I'll simply think in ideas, in concepts, and it only forms itself into one of the words I know for it when I actually need to use it to interface with language in some formal way. If that makes any sense at all. I live in America now. Fluent in English, French, Bosnian, and Dutch. I always think in French. I was born and raised in France, so it's personally what I find more comfortable. Loving this thread because it's sort of blowing my mind. Also, everyone in this thread chose to think in English to comment, edit, grammar. To be fair, people who browse an English speaking site are more likely to be consuming mostly English media. Correct. My native language is Slovene. Yet, I read posts on Reddit that are in English. I write English comments. I watch videos in English. I listen to English music. I read news in English. All the video games I play are in English. I watch English TV, etc. And I do all these things almost every day. Is it any wonder then that I often think in English? I suspect almost everyone who wrote a comment on this post about not being a native English speaker but thinking in English had the same sort of circumstances. They think in English mostly because of internet. I never understood that. I don't think in a particular language. I never did. I think in thoughts? I don't know. The pure concepts just flow into my head and I then translate them into speech. Ducking like and subscribe.